three guests on this show who either knew Epstein or knew Trump have all used the exact same words to describe Trump and Epstein's relationship over the past week as we've been talking to them and you've heard them. And they have done this totally unprompted. So here is a former Trump business executive, one of Epstein's former girlfriends, and an Epstein accuser who says she had a troubling incident with Trump. They all said the exact same thing here on Outfront.
They were best friends.
They were best friends.
Was his best friend.
You heard them, and right there, Jack O'Donnell, Trump's former business associate, talking about what Epstein meant to Trump. These are people, right, who each met Epstein and Trump at different times, in different places, and just to state the obvious, in totally different capacities. And yet they all concur on this crucial thing. They say that when they knew them, Trump and Epstein were best friends. So in just a moment, I'm going to speak to Mark Epstein. He is the brother of Jeffrey Epstein about all of this. Out front now, Mark Epstein, the brother of Jeffrey Epstein. And Mark, you know, from what you know, from what you saw, how close was your brother to Donald Trump?
They were very close. They were good friends. Jeffrey used to sometimes tell me things that Donald said that were funny. I know Donald was in Jeff's office a lot back in the 90s. It's documented that Donald flew on Jeff's plane a number of times. I don't know if they ever checked, but I know Jeff flew on Donald's plane also. I don't know if they've ever looked at his flight logs. And they were good friends. I mean, I flew on Jeff's plane. It's known I was on the plane in 1999, flying up from Florida, and Donald was with us. You know, and we were all joking around. They were good friends.
So, you know, tell me about that. I know there was something on that flight that you remember about your brother and Trump. What is it?
Well, it was a funny thing when we were talking, and, well, stick a pin in that. A couple weeks or a week before that flight, I was talking to Jeffrey, and he told me that he was talking to Donald, and he asked Donald, how come you sleep with so many married women? And Donald's answer was, because it's so wrong. Now, amongst guys, it was a funny line. And then when we were on the plane a week or two later, Jeffrey asked Donald the same question. I know he did that for my benefit so that I could hear Donald say it. And Jeffrey asked him, how come you sleep with so many married women? And Donald said, because it's so wrong. Now, it's a funny line, but the answer is not the poignant part of the story here. The question is the poignant part, because for Jeffrey to ask him that question, number one, he would have to know that Donald slept with a lot of married women, so and he probably got that information from Donald. And
it
also,
implies a confidence.
That's not the kind of question you ask a casual acquaintance. You know, how come you slept with so many married women? That's a question you ask a good friend that you can get away with asking those kind of questions. So that gives you an idea of how friendly they were.
Yes, it does. It does. It certainly gives that perception. Now, okay, Mark, Trump admits they had a falling out with your brother. That's what he said happened. He has not shared what led to it. But here are some of the things that he has been willing to say about your brother. I want to play them for you.
I was not a fan of Jeffrey Epstein. I threw him out of a club. I didn't want anything to do with him. Jeffrey Epstein was not somebody that I respected.
That does not fit with what you're telling me, Mark.
Yeah, I understand it doesn't. But he's trying to cover his butt. I mean, look, I understand people trying to distance themselves from Jeffrey because of what he was charged with and the circumstances he found himself in. I understand that. You know, but I know that they were good friends, and I witnessed it myself.
You mentioned something a moment ago that made me think of this, you know, something that the White House told us yesterday. We talked to a woman who accused your brother of sexual assault, and she also talked about an encounter with Trump at your brother's office. This was in 1995. She found it disturbing. She said she told the FBI twice to look into people around your brother, including Trump. But she talked about this incident that she said happened in his office. And the White House, their response to us, Mark, they were categorical. They said, quote, the president was never in Epstein's office. Is that true?
That's just another blatant lie, because he was there. The people that worked for Jeffrey in his office, you can find them. They can testify that they saw Trump in Jeffrey's office on numerous occasions. So for him to say he wasn't there, all I could say is that's just another lie.
So you talk about him as your brother, and you're you were on the plane together at that time. When did your brother first tell you that he was in legal trouble? When did you know anything about what he was doing?
It was about 2006 when he first got into trouble. It's known prior to Jeffrey's death, I hadn't seen him for 7 years, although we were always in touch, communication with telephone or emails, but we just never got together. And for the 12 years prior to that period of time, from like 2004 until 2008, we only got together maybe a half a dozen times or so, but we were always in contact. And in 2006, Jeffrey asked me to come up to his place uptown. He wanted to talk to me. So I was uptown. I stopped by. I'm not uptown all that much back then. I live downtown, and I sort of joke. I say to go above 14th Street, I need a visa. But so I went to talk to him, and that's when he told me that he was getting in trouble for being with girls that were too young. He said he was stupid, but he wanted me to hear it from him as opposed to hearing it on the news or something. And that's when I first found out. In 2006.
All right. And the reason that this is so important is trying to understand what the people around Epstein would have known, separate from what any of them might have also been doing, right? So I guess the question here then, Mark, is did you have any suspicions before Jeffrey's confession to you that he was involved with underage girls?
No, because I rarely saw him, so I didn't know what he was involved with. We had different lives. He had his friends, and I had my friends. We traveled in two separate circles, in a sense. A few people we knew together, but, he was more in the financial community uptown. I was more involved with the arts community downtown. So we had two separate lives, but we were brothers. We always stayed in touch. But the thing is, Aaron, the thing with the charges against him, that's really not my concern at this point in time. Jeffrey is dead. So, I'm not the prosecutor. I'm not his defense attorney. I'm more concerned with the circumstances around what I now consider his murder.
Right. So
that's unsolved.
So I want to ask you that, okay, because the Department of Justice issued that memo earlier this month, right? It's at the core of a lot of this that reads in part, and I quote, Mark, after a thorough investigation, FBI investigators concluded that Jeffrey Epstein committed suicide in his cell. Now, you say you were the one called to identify his body. You had conversations at that time. And you do not accept this finding.
No, I don't, because what they don't mention in the report, and no one says, is that, after Jeffrey died, the next day I had to go to, number one, to identify his body because I'm the next of kin, his only heir. And they did the autopsy then. And Dr. Roman, who was the city pathologist, it was her autopsy. And Dr. Bondman was there on my behalf because I had the right to have the family has the right to have their own pathologist there. And they did the autopsy, and they came out of the autopsy a couple hours later, and they both concurred that they could not call this a suicide because it looked too much like a homicide. They're very clear about that.
All right, Mark, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Have a good day.